Immediately challenging the center with a flank pawn immediately influences the board's spatial dynamics and hints at aggressive intentions, solidifying central control while preparing a d5 advance. This creates a flexible pawn structure for the black queen's pawn game. Opening the center this way aims to seize immediate space and launch an attack on the d7 pawn, challenging the center head-on. This response immediately creates dynamic pawn tension, forcing white to decide the central battleground's fate. Striking the central pawn immediately opens lines, forcing black to react and potentially ceding initiative on the d-file. Recapturing the pawn opens the c-file, a potential battleground for rooks, and establishes a solid central pawn chain for black. Establishing central control, white aims to build a commanding pawn presence, potentially pressuring black's structure. Developing a knight to control central squares and prepare for castling is a fundamental step, aiming to solidify the pawn structure against white's ambitious center. Developing the knight to its most active square. This piece now influences the d5 pawn and prepares for potential kingside expansion. Solidifying the pawn center. Black prepares for a developing struggle while allowing white a slight space advantage. Developing the knight to its natural outpost solidifies central control and prepares for castling, harmonizing white's pieces for the impending positional battle that will unfold across the board. Instantly challenging the knight on c3. This bishop aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially create an immediate pin, forcing a decision and impacting the development of white's queenside. Developing the bishop to d3 solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares for castling. Kingside. Aiming for a comfortable and harmonious setup where pieces work together efficiently. Black immediately offers a pawn to free their bishop and open diagonals for their pieces, disrupting white's central pawn structure and aiming for active piece play. This gambit, while seemingly risky, can lead to dynamic counterplay if white isn't careful about consolidating their material advantage. Capturing the pawn on c4 efficiently regains material and immediately challenges black's central pawn structure, opening lines for white's pieces and setting up potential pressure down the d-file. Finally, the monarch seeks refuge from the center's storm, a crucial step towards mobilizing those less active pieces and securing a defensive perimeter. This fundamental maneuver, while seemingly passive, unlocks the potential for counterplay on the queenside and allows development of the remaining minor pieces to more active squares. Castling on the kingside now firmly secures the monarch, a crucial preparatory step before potentially initiating central pawn advances or probing the queenside. Planning to secure the b5 square and potentially initiate a queenside pawn storm. This move subtly challenges white's bishop placement and aims to gain breathing room, hinting at a desire to break free from the center's inherent rigidity. Reclaiming the bishop from its momentarily exposed square sets up a subtle piece rearrangement, aiming to consolidate the center and prepare for potential queenside expansion with b4, while simultaneously offering better diagonal scope for the monarch. Probing for queenside space. This pawn advances aggressively, seeking to disrupt white's bishop and gain a foothold on that flank. It potentially opens lines for black's rook and prepares to contest the b-file. However, this territorial expansion might also create a backward pawn or weaken the pawn structure if white can exploit the overextension. Initiating a pawn thrust can dramatically alter the pawn structure, aiming to seize central space and restrict black's development, though it simultaneously opens lines for counterplay and potentially creates weaknesses. Exchanging the bishop for the knight unravels white's pawn structure, potentially liberating black's pieces for a more active role. though it also grants white a central pawn majority. Sacrificing material here gambles on the disruption of black's pawn structure, potentially opening lines towards the king and creating long-term weaknesses, even if the immediate material deficit is significant. Strategically withdrawing the bishop to create attacking lines for the queen and rook, simultaneously bolstering the defense of the pawns on the queenside. Sacrificing the pawn on f7 unleashes a ferocious attack, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and disrupt black's pawn structure with a sudden thunderclap. Securing the king's safety is paramount after the forceful exchange on f7, preventing any immediate tactical intrusion from the opponent's activated pieces. Unleashing the bishop to f4 injects immediate tension, eyeing the uncastled king and preparing to exploit the pawn chain's structural weaknesses. It's a bold statement of intent to disrupt black's developing harmony and seize the initiative. Reclaiming central space with the knight solidifies black's pawn structure, offering a much-needed defender for the now more vulnerable king's flank while preparing for potential kingside activity. Unlocking the h-file provides a clear attacking avenue, forcing black to confront a growing spatial advantage and the looming threat on the king's vicinity. This move, bg4, immediately challenges the fianchettoed bishop and seeks to untangle black's queenside pawns by forcing a decision on the dark squares. It introduces a tactical skirmish, potentially leading to exchanges that could simplify the position or open lines for further action. The knight on f6 finds itself supported, and black hopes to relieve the pressure that white's advanced pawn on d5 has been exerting. Consider the repercussions of white's subsequent recapture, as it could solidify their central control or create weaknesses. The rook now anchors the c-file, a bold assertion of control that eyes black's vulnerable queenside pawn structure and potentially opens avenues for further pressure should black misplace their pieces. Developing the knight to e7 aims to reinforce the d5 pawn and offer a retreat square for the bishop on a5 should it come under attack from the rook on c1, while simultaneously preparing to shuffle the other knight to g6 to contest the weakened kingside. Fortifying the bishop on c5 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create potential attacking avenues on the queenside by controlling key squares and subtly putting pressure on the pinned knight. A fascinating positional skirmish develops as black boldly injects the knight into the heart of white's position, challenging the established control and threatening to unravel the central pawn structure. This daring outpost for the knight on e4 promises a dynamic struggle, potentially disrupting white's harmonious development and creating tactical opportunities by forcing white's pieces to react. Observe how this central knight aims to exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king and how it influences the ongoing battle for piece activity. Unlocking the d-file with the queen swap signals a deliberate attempt to simplify into a potentially favorable endgame, leveraging the initiative gained from the piece activity. Exchanging the bishop on d8, black initiates a crucial transition towards the endgame, aiming to simplify the position and potentially exploit white's slightly misplaced queen. The immediate recapture of the knight opens a central file and liberates your rook, preparing to exert pressure on the d-file where black's king is now exposed. The capture of the bishop clears the way for white's pieces, but black's king still enjoys a degree of sanctuary for the moment. The immediate concern is reinforcing the light squares and preparing for the inevitable fight for central control as the game progresses toward its likely endgame phase. Re-establishing the rook's influence on the open file. This maneuver signals an intention to exploit the lingering weaknesses around black's monarch. With the queens gone, white aims to coordinate the remaining pieces for an offensive surge. leveraging the diagonal pressure created by the bishop on b3 and preparing for potential pawn advancements or piece sacrifices. The game has transitioned into a complex middle game where piece activity and control of open lines are paramount. This rook repositioning is a key step in White's plan to activate its forces and generate threats. The bishop on e7 has been somewhat passively placed, and this rook move might create opportunities for White to attack it directly or indirectly, forcing Black into defensive maneuvers. The strategic landscape now favors White's ability to pressure Black's queenside structure, and the rook's presence on the e-file adds a crucial attacking dimension to White's position. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, aiming to control squares beyond the immediate fray and potentially unburdening the g6 square from its current defensive duty, reclaiming the bishop's central square. This move is about redeploying your pieces with newfound harmony, aiming to exert pressure along the c-file and prepare for potential advances on the queenside. Harnessing the open c-file now becomes paramount, and establishing a presence there with the rook is a logical, proactive step to challenge White's centralized pieces and prepare for potential skirmishes down the line. Unleashing a knight onto the central squares, White aims to disrupt Black's harmonious development and challenge the bishop pair's influence. This aggressive positioning immediately pressures squares and forces Black to react, potentially creating weaknesses or simplifying the position in White's favor. This maneuver re-centers the bishop, seeking active participation from the queenside and a potential shield for the king's flank. Pivoting the knight to e6 seizes control of a critical central outpost, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king. This knight placement, supported by the bishop on c2, exerts significant pressure and limits Black's piece mobility, forcing a reactive stance rather than allowing further development of Black's pieces. Unleashing the rook to a more active file. This pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt White's potentially crushing queenside pressure and bring Black's remaining forces into the game. However, it leaves the Black king with fewer defenders and could accelerate the loss of material if White can coordinate an attack on the weakened royal structure. Seizing the initiative to eliminate the pinned knight, White initiates a decisive sequence, aiming to exploit Black's compromised kingside structure and potentially liberate the d-file. This exchange, while seemingly straightforward, strategically clears the path for White's rooks and forces Black into a defensive posture, potentially leading to material imbalances or advantageous pawn structures for White as the game progresses. Liberating the rook from its defensive duties. This capture initiates a dynamic reshuffling of forces, aiming to exploit the currently awkward placement of White's knight on d4 and potentially open lines against the castled king. Reclaiming the rook initiates the final stage of simplification, aiming to leverage the more active rook and potentially exploit Black's somewhat passive bishop placement as exchanges continue. Black retrieves the material by recapturing the bishop, aiming to simplify into an endgame where the extra pawn might become a significant factor. This decisive check forces Black's king into a precarious exposed position, aiming to dismantle its defensive shield and potentially deliver a swift mating attack. The king's escape route now feels alarmingly narrow, a consequence of surrendering the central files and allowing White's pieces such commanding influence. Snatching the rook on f8 solidifies White's material advantage and removes a dangerous attacker, simplifying the position towards a favorable endgame. Considering the immediate threat to the g7 pawn and the potential for further disruption, Black's decision to defend the pawn is a practical one. though it does concede a significant positional advantage as white maintains control of the open files and actively pursues the vulnerable enemy king, bolstering the pawn chain to prevent any infiltration on the kingside and preparing to potentially launch a central thrust later on. Strategically, the bishop retreats to a less exposed square, looking to influence the queenside majority and potentially support a kingside pawn advance in the future, though its current role is primarily defensive, guarding against any immediate infiltration on the b file. Asserting dominance over the central files with the rook's repositioning signals a significant shift toward gaining decisive control of the board's core. Securing the king's safety becomes paramount now, as the rook's foray onto the open d file forces a swift relocation to prevent further encroachment and potential tactical issues arising from the centralized white pieces. King hunting takes center stage as the knight leaps into the fray, threatening to skewer the already vulnerable monarch and disrupt black's pawn shield. Stepping the king back towards the center may seem prudent, but it also surrenders valuable breathing room, potentially trapping the bishop on g6 if white manages to reinforce the f-file. Safeguarding your monarch is paramount as the board simplifies. This repositioning directly addresses potential threats on the king's flank, preparing for defensive consolidation. Challenging the central pawn structure with g5 attempts to open a pathway for the black king. But it also weakens the pawn shield protecting it, potentially creating new targets for white's rooks and bishop. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank presents a potent threat of penetration towards the king, potentially disrupting black's defensive setup. Initiating an exchange here, black simplifies the position, aiming to activate the rook on the d file and alleviate some pressure on their king. This decision signals a shift towards an endgame where pawn structure and piece activity will be paramount. A bold check, seizing the initiative to disrupt black's already compromised king safety and forcing a significant material exchange that promises to simplify the position advantage as Slee. Suddenly facing a discovered check requires immediate, decisive action to protect the monarch. Reclaiming the knight initiates a crucial endgame transition, aiming to eliminate black's past pawn potential and leverage white's slight material advantage for a decisive advantage in the pawn race. Unblocking the bishop now seems like a reasonable attempt to bring it back into the game, but the immediate threat on the d file is a concern. A daring maneuver, nc5 immediately targets the c-pawn and simultaneously aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for the knight's future activity, forcing a reactive response from black. Opening up the queenside with that pawn thrust aims to create counterplay, potentially seizing control of the a-file or forcing a queen exchange later. But it does leave the white king a bit more exposed in the center if black can orchestrate further pressure, deploying the king from its defensive corner. This decision seeks to activate the monarch, transforming it into a fighting piece capable of supporting the pawn structure and potentially influencing the central squares as the endgame materializes. Bailing out of the threatened pawn advance, the black king ventures forth from its protective pawn shield, aiming to engage directly in the unfolding endgame skirmishes. Unlocking the king's central potential, the monarch begins a daring march towards the heart of the board, aiming to join the fray and exert influence over crucial squares. The king ventures boldly into the fray, seeking to disrupt white's pawn majority on the kingside by becoming an active participant in the central struggle. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain solidifies white's structure against any black advances, preventing the opponent from gaining a foothold on the open queenside files. Unleashing the pawn storm forward on the kingside, Black seeks to disrupt white's otherwise solid central structure, aiming to create immediate threats or force concessions before white can fully consolidate their advantage. Capturing the pawn opens a critical diagonal for the rook, threatening to unravel black's pawn shield and expose the king. The monarch bravely marches forward, seeking fresh pastures amidst the collapsing pawn structure, a bold gamble to exploit the exposed white king. Solidifying the pawn chain, g3 prepares for a potential pawn storm on the kingside, while simultaneously creating a safe haven for the king on g2 if needed. The black king, having danced across the board, now finds itself in a precarious position, vulnerable to the white pawn's advance and the looming threat of a potential discovered attack if black is not careful with the placement of their remaining pieces. Initiating a king march towards the center can be a shrewd maneuver in endgames, aiming to activate the monarch and gain influence over key squares. Spotting an opponent's king exposed on the 7th rank after a series of exchanges is a golden opportunity. Snatching that pawn looks tempting, but it allows the white king to aggressively march forward and solidify its presence in black's territory. Re-establishing central control is paramount as the pawns are about to become kingly decorations. The monarch now ventures into potentially open territory, inviting a more active role in the ongoing pawn race. The bishop retreats, seeking a less exposed diagonal. The knight leaps to d3, aiming to reposition itself towards the queenside, perhaps preparing a later foray onto c5 or b4 to contest black's advanced pawns. Shifting the bishop to c4 aims to contest the central pawn structure and potentially fork the knights, but it neglects the open d-file, leaving the king exposed to further pressure. Dislodging the entrenched black bishop is paramount, as its position on c4 is a constant thorn, restricting white's pawn advances and offering potential tactical leverage. The bishop redirects, aiming to support the pawn push and potentially occupy the now open queen's diagonal on the kingside, while also keeping a watchful eye on the white knight's potential outpost. Clearing the way for the knight to deliver a decisive check. This maneuver aims to force the black king into a vulnerable position on the kingside, potentially leading to a swift mating attack or a significant material gain. The king now ventures into a more active, though potentially perilous, central position, seeking to join the fight for control over the critical squares leading to a potential pawn breakthrough. Prying open the king's shelter. The knight's excursion to h6 directly targets the pawn structure's integrity and prepares for further incursions towards the exposed black monarch. Unlocking the passed pawn's potential on the queenside offers a fresh tactical avenue, though its advance demands careful calculation to avoid becoming a pawn sacrifice.